Something big has just shaken the United States. Gasoline shortages are no longer just a rumor. They are real, and they're spreading fast. The trigger? Canada, America's closest neighbor and biggest oil supplier, has suddenly cut back on its oil exports. This move has left at least 7 U.S. states on high alert. Emergency meetings are being called, governors are rushing to respond, and gas stations are already reporting supply crunches. What was once considered unthinkable, a North American fuel shortage, has suddenly arrived at America's doorstep. For decades, the U.S. has relied on Canada as a dependable partner. Canada supplies more oil to America than any other country in the world. In fact, nearly half of U.S. crude imports come directly from Canadian pipelines. Losing that stream is like shutting off the oxygen to America's energy system. The timing could not be worse. Americans are already struggling with high prices for groceries, rent, and utilities. Now, gas prices are rising by the day. In some places, prices have already jumped by 30 to 40 cents in just a week. If the situation continues, experts warn we could see spikes of up to a full $1 per gallon. So why did Canada make this move? Canadian officials say they are prioritizing their own domestic needs. With rising global oil prices and internal pressures from provinces like Alberta, Ottawa insists it cannot keep sending unlimited oil south, while Canadians face their own shortages and price hikes at home. But critics see another side. Some analysts argue this is political leverage. Canada and the U.S. have been clashing over climate policy, carbon taxes, and pipeline disputes. Cutting oil exports could be Canada's way of sending a strong message to Washington. Don't take our energy for granted. The impact is being felt most severely in states that rely heavily on Canadian crude. Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, Montana, South Dakota, and Missouri are all now officially on alert. These states depend directly on pipelines crossing from Alberta and Saskatchewan. With reduced flow, their refineries are struggling to keep up. Gas stations in parts of Michigan and Wisconsin have already placed limits on purchases, some allowing only 10 to 15 gallons per customer. Long lines have been reported at several stations, as drivers fear shortages similar to those seen during past pipeline disruptions. Truck drivers are among the first to feel the pain. With diesel supplies tightening, shipping companies are warning of delayed deliveries and higher costs. Farmers, who depend on diesel for their equipment, are also bracing for financial strain just as harvest season approaches. Airlines, too, are watching closely. Jet fuel prices are climbing, and regional carriers that operate out of airports in the Midwest are particularly vulnerable. A prolonged shortage could mean higher ticket prices, flight delays, or even cancellations. Washington is under immense pressure to act. Lawmakers are calling on the White House to release millions of barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But experts caution this is only a temporary solution. The U.S. cannot simply replace Canadian oil with reserves or imports from other nations overnight. The reason is simple: logistics. Canada's oil flows through established pipelines directly into U.S. refineries. Replacing that with oil from overseas would require complex shipping arrangements, additional refining adjustments, and higher transportation costs. In short, Meanwhile, Canadian leaders remain firm. Prime Minister Trudeau has defended the cuts, stating that Canadian households must come first. Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith echoed that message, saying that exporting too much oil while Canadians face energy insecurity would be politically unacceptable. This has sparked fierce backlash in the U.S. Critics argue that Canada is abandoning its role as a trusted ally. Some lawmakers are even calling for retaliation, such as tariffs on Canadian goods, if exports are not restored quickly. But the reality is that Canada holds a powerful card. The U.S. may be a global superpower, but when it comes to oil, it is deeply tied to Canadian supply. Breaking that dependency would take years, not weeks. For everyday Americans, the crisis feels very personal. Families are worried about affording their daily commutes. Small businesses are warning they may have to raise prices or cut back on operations. Rural communities, with fewer gas stations and longer travel distances, are especially vulnerable. Social media is amplifying the panic. Videos of empty pumps and long waiting lines are spreading fast, fueling fears of hoarding and panic buying. Officials are pleading with citizens not to overreact, but the uncertainty is already creating a snowball effect. Energy economists warn that the longer this lasts, the more severe the consequences will be. If shortages stretch beyond a few weeks, the ripple effects could hit every corner of the economy, from higher shipping costs for goods to inflation spikes across multiple industries. And if Canada's export cuts continue, the U.S. will have no choice but to reconsider its entire energy strategy. For decades, America has relied on Canadian oil as the safest and cheapest option, but this crisis has exposed just how vulnerable that dependence really is. One option would be to increase domestic oil production. The U.S. already produces more oil than almost any other country in the world, but refining capacity and infrastructure have not kept up with rising demand. Expanding drilling in places like Texas, North Dakota, and offshore fields could reduce dependency, but that comes with political and environmental battles. Another strategy is refinery expansion. Even if the U.S. drills more oil, the crude has to be processed into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Many American refineries are old, running at maximum capacity, and not designed for the specific types of crude available. Building or upgrading refineries is expensive, takes years, and often faces heavy opposition from local communities and environmental groups. Then there's the push toward alternative energy. Crises like this often spark renewed debates about electric vehicles, renewable energy, and nuclear power. Supporters argue that relying less on oil is the only long-term solution. But critics point out that the U.S. infrastructure for EVs, solar, and wind power is still not ready to replace oil on a massive scale, especially when it comes to heavy trucking, aviation, and farming equipment. All of these solutions sound promising, but they share one major problem. They take time. Building new drilling projects or refineries can take 5 to 10 years. Transitioning to clean energy is an even longer process. That means none of these fixes will help the states currently facing shortages. For now, America remains exposed. 7 states are already on alert, monitoring fuel reserves daily and preparing for emergency rationing if supplies keep falling. If Canadian cuts deepen, the crisis could spread quickly, first across the Midwest, then to the East Coast, and finally nationwide. The ripple effects would be enormous. Imagine truck fleets unable to transport goods, airlines cutting routes due to fuel shortages, and families forced to cancel travel plans because gas prices are simply unaffordable. These are not distant possibilities. They could become reality in weeks if the supply gap isn't filled. That's why energy experts are calling this a wake-up call. America's over-reliance on Canadian oil has left it exposed, and unless urgent action is taken, this won't just be a short-term shock. It could be the beginning of repeated energy crises in the future. The next 48 to 72 hours are critical. If Canadian exports are not restored soon, we could be looking at one of the most significant energy shocks in North American history. This story is unfolding by the hour. If gas prices in your area haven't jumped yet, they could soon. What happens next could affect not just your wallet, but the entire U.S. economy.